Hello, I'm Amanda Walker, and welcome to Inside America, the show that brings you insight and analysis of the biggest issues facing the United States right now. In today's episode, a new era of political violence. A recent wave of brazen brutality is raising fears that a new normal is taking hold in America. The murder of a Minnesota state representative and her husband sparked a national outcry.
It's just the fact that this is where we are as a country. It's really tore me up. I don't think I'm alone in saying I think the country's in the worst state it's been in since the Civil War.
Coming up, we'll be asking what's motivating this kind of violence that has shaped America's past and is now defining its future.
I'm very worried, to be blunt. I'm afraid that we haven't seen anything close to what is likely to come, especially as midterm elections here approach.
If you want to really see something that's said, take a look at what happened.
1 year ago, a shot seared into the nation's memory. Then Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump bloodied and defiant as Secret Service agents dragged him off stage. An assassination attempt that shattered the illusion of safety in that most established tradition, the political campaign trail. Just 2 months later, a second assassination attempt as Trump played golf at home in Florida, marking a new and dangerous chapter of US political violence. This year alone began with horror on day one. A truck barreled into crowds of families in New Orleans, killing 15 people. Police say the driver was a US veteran turned domestic terrorist. What began as online rage exploded into a terrifying reality. The FBI issued a striking statement in response. During the past few years, lone actors or small cells of individuals have posed the greatest terrorism threat to our homeland. In March, the Republican Party headquarters in New Mexico went up in flames in a suspected politically motivated attack. Then, 2 weeks later, in Pennsylvania, another arson attack, this time on the other side of the political aisle, at the home of Democratic Governor Josh Shapiro. Addressing reporters, Governor Shapiro described the harrowing night.
I heard yelling in the hallway, which was not like our kids' voices. It was one of the state troopers running down the hallway, and he banged on the door. Said, "Governor, First Lady, we got to get up. There's a fire. We got to evacuate immediately."
Memphis Mayor Paul Young was also targeted in an attempted kidnapping. The police statement said the suspect, who seemingly acted alone, had a taser, rope and duct tape in his car. Such attacks are creating a climate of fear. A recent study shows a spike in requests from local officials for increased safety support, and 40% say they are less likely to run for re-election due to threats of violence. Mounting attacks on public officials are happening against a broader backdrop of political and social instability. In June, Los Angeles immigration protests exploded into chaos. A journalist was shot live on air with a rubber bullet. Cars were torched and National Guard troops deployed. These images sending a fevered message to the nation.
The most common form of political violence that we see in the United States has consistently been demonstrations that turn violent, simply because protests are the most common form of political action that we record in the United States.
Kieran Doyle is a researcher with armed conflict location and event data, which has been tracking political violence since 2020.
Although the vast majority of those are peaceful, the subsection that turns violent just ends up being a larger number of events than these other forms of political violence.
The most egregious and devastating act of political violence this year was surely the murder of Minnesota Democrat Melissa Hortman and her husband Mark. They were shot dead in their home in what authorities called a political assassination. The gunman had already opened fire at the home of another lawmaker, his hit list clear, his message unmistakable. In today's America, disagreement has metastasized into danger. The old metaphor, fighting for democracy, has turned quite literal.
Now, the FBI often calls these lone wolf attacks, but are they truly an isolated act, or is there a deeper web of coordination that we're missing? Amy Cooter is an expert on extremist groups, having spent years embedded with some of America's most notorious ones. Amy, thanks so much for joining us. So we're just a few blocks from the US Capitol, of course, the scene of the January 6th insurrection. Having spent so many years with the kinds of groups that were there, what do you think was behind that specifically? What was the motivation there?
I think the motivation for militia members, as well as other people who were there who weren't connected to any group, was basically about trying to reclaim American culture. Many of them genuinely believed that the election had been stolen, but even that idea is reflective of their fear that the country was going a way that they did not agree with.
So post-January 6th, post-pardons, what's been the reaction within that community? Did it go from kind of retreat to feeling emboldened by those pardons?
There's been a mixed reaction within the militia movement, but in general, I think that most militia members feel like the Trump administration has their back and is supporting their interest. Most of them seem prepared to support him in return, and that could translate to a variety of actions in coming years.
And when you're listening to those conversations, when you're embedded with these people, how much do they talk about Donald Trump?
That also varies within different groups. Many of them don't even like him personally, but they generally believe that his policies support them or are aligned with their interests. So they talk a lot about immigration and other things that he's doing right now.
And what about the terminology? Because you mentioned militias. We hear a lot about domestic terrorists from the authorities. What is the difference between the two, and does law enforcement treat them differently?
So law enforcement does treat them differently. Many militias are just engaging in private action. They're going and target shooting, they're practicing other skills that are kind of like survivalist skills with each other. But we do have some groups that move into a domestic terror framework when they engage in certain kinds of political violence, when they take it upon themselves to hurt people, or even sometimes hurt symbols of the government to try to intimidate people into changing their actions.
And another phrase we hear a lot is lone wolf. How accurate is that?
There's been a tendency in certain academic circles to get rid of the term lone wolf in recent years, but I think some version of it's still important for our understanding of the landscape, because we do have people who are informed by the internet, they learn lessons on their own, and then they commit actions. We have other people who meet together as groups and they plan their actions together jointly. We tend to see some differences across those types of actors in terms of their motivations, the types of actions they take, and their overall threat level.
And I'm just fascinated by the work that you've done, being embedded, being incredibly close to some very dangerous people. Has it been scary for you?
I had some scary moments in the field for sure, but for the most part, I think that most of these militia guys see themselves as normal people. They really take pride in following the law. And many of them are very similar to folks I grew up with in a rural environment. For me, that was a good reminder of how militias can actually be a barometer of some broader swaths of Americana that we don't always pay attention to in some of our political forecasting. Based off of not just how militias were responding, but how my home community were responding to Trump's first campaign, I was not remotely surprised that he won, or frankly that he's back in office. And I think if we pay more attention to groups like this, it helps us predict and understand our political landscape better.
And what are they feeding off? Because all of this is evolving with the kind of media landscape that's changing. How much of a role is the internet playing in the life of someone who has violence on their minds and wants to bring it to fruition?
The internet and social media in particular are just incredible toolkits for folks who maybe are considering political violence. Not only can they go to certain websites and learn about tactical things, they can find manifestos, they can understand generally more of an ideological framework for some of their perspectives, but they also really tend to fall into online echo chambers. And so whatever grievances drove them to this search in the first place become amplified, become tied to the glorification of violence, and it's really hard to escape that.
And there are no obvious answers, but having so much knowledge about this, what do you see as a way of at least decreasing this?
You know, it's really tough. Some of our peer countries have much more strict regulations on what people can exchange or even view online. And we prioritize freedom of speech here for good reason. But we think that just the accessibility of some of this material does make it more likely that some people could move to a violent framework. We, in our field, try to work with the tech companies to help them understand these trends and patterns and help them shift policy and moderation techniques to help prevent some of this as well.
And have you learned any clear signs or warnings of how to spot when somebody or a group might be about to do something unthinkable?
There's not one clear-cut signal, unfortunately, but some of the things we might consider are greater embeddedness in some of these online communities, someone for the first time going out and buying weapons or materials where theoretically they could make explosives or toy around even with something like that. A big danger sign, maybe also counterintuitive. We've seen some cases where people go dark, where they've had a heavy online presence and then they drop that down to nothing right before they act as well.
And how would you characterize where we are now when it comes to the political violence that we're all witnessing on the news on a frequent basis? And how worried should we be about something bigger than even what we've seen happening in the future?
I'm very worried, to be blunt. I'm afraid that we haven't seen anything close to what is likely to come, especially as midterm elections here approach. We're at a moment, though, where it's very difficult to monitor all of that because basically all the funding that had previously gone into monitoring these spaces and supporting different centers outside the government to do this work has disappeared in recent months. And so we can't accurately forecast exactly what we might see, even as the tenor online and in other places is really indicative that we should all be concerned.
Tell me more about that. Specifically, what kind of things are you worried about happening?
I don't have a crystal ball, but I think in the US, and with regards to not just militias, but other armed folks, it's likely that we will again see different acts of intimidation around the election, whether it's people monitoring ballot drop-off locations, whether it's direct intimidation or threats to election officials, whether it's outright violence like we've seen already in some cases directed to politicians. I'm afraid it's going to be more of the same.
And you talked about Donald Trump not necessarily being a hero, but being someone that there's an affinity with. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but would you say that? So the idea of leadership doing something about this, does that just seem impossible when you have a figurehead who is kind of on the same page in terms of their perspective? That's how they feel.
Yeah, I'm afraid it does seem impossible. I think right now the administration benefits from having a group of folks who are potentially primed to act, and I think there's very few incentives to then speak against them.
And what should we all be watching out for, especially with the midterms coming up?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a tough question because there's so many things, frankly, that are already happening. When we have ICE agents who are masked, who refuse to show identity, that really lends the possibility of some of this external help and people acting even more illegitimately and potentially dangerously. And so I think that if we have people in our circles who are supportive of these actions, it's important to remind them of the Constitution and how we as Americans are supposed to value things like due process.
Okay, really interesting conversation. Thank you so much, Amy.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, rage like we saw on January 6th doesn't erupt in a vacuum. It builds, speech by speech, rally by rally, post by post. Here's a look at how President Trump's language over the years has echoed through moments like these.
Let's put her with a rifle standing there with 9 barrels shooting at her, okay? Let's see how she feels about it. You know, when the guns are trained on her face.
But I think we should go much, much, much further than waterboarding.
I love the old days. You know what they used to do to guys like that when they were in a place like this? They'd be carried out on a stretcher, folks. And he's walking out like big high fives, smiling, laughing. Like to punch him in the face, I'll tell you.
Any guy that can do a body slam, he's my kind of...
As we just saw, Trump's rhetoric has at times added fuel to the fire, reverberating through moments of real-world violence. And yet, when these incidents occur, we see a familiar pattern play out in the media. Initial shock, followed by thoughts and prayers and platitudes, and then the cycle moves on. It's hard to see what, if anything, is being learned or changed. Let's discuss with our panel. Charles Wilson is the chairman of the DC Democratic Party, and Matthew Hurt is chairman of the Arlington County Republican Party. Charles, let me start with you. So when we hear about elected officials needing bulletproof vests, about mayors having death threats, what does that tell us about the state of our democracy right now?
I think you sum it up in one word: is scary. Most people start off in these career fields as volunteers in their own communities, and they just rise through the ranks to say, you know what, I want to do this on a larger level to be able to serve my constituents, either in the city or their state or in the country, because they have good hearts and they want to do good work on behalf of their residents. Now that they've seen what happened in Minnesota and other parts of the country, they're scared that you have to go to work with a bulletproof vest, or you have to have security to accompany you to work. That's not the America that people want to live in. And I think if we don't find solutions to this, you're going to find good people who shy away from this career field.
Right. And Matthew, few people would say that this is not a crisis point. Is the leader of this country doing enough to calm things down, or does it fit his agenda to have people fired up?
Well, in the last week, we've seen attacks on ICE and law enforcement agents in Texas. We've seen the hyperbolic conversation around are Republicans Nazis or are Democrats worthy of consideration? And I think on both sides, we really have to tone the rhetoric down and talk about the issues that matter to the American people. Even as a county party chairman in the last election, I received phone calls and menacing emails and threatening calls that really concerned me as Charles said, as a volunteer in this process. We really have to work on the tone and tenor of our political discourse.
But does the president have to work on toning down his rhetoric? We heard a few moments ago the kinds of things he is saying. They are incendiary.
I absolutely think that it is President Trump's responsibility to tone down the rhetoric, but we've also seen it from millions of activists across the country who demonize either Republicans or Democrats. In my home county of Arlington, I'm frequently called a Nazi just for having conservative views. And I think that on both sides, we should be responsible enough to talk about these issues and remove the incendiary rhetoric.
Those activists, Charles, are not the president. For example, should the president have attended the funeral of Melissa Hortman, the Minnesota representative who was murdered in her own home?
Absolutely. And I think the tone starts at the top. And people look to whoever that leader is to set the tone and say, you know what, this is not right. And the fact that he was not even willing to call the governor to offer his condolences, sends a message to people that you don't, that these lives don't matter. And because they were a different party, they don't matter. Like we need to literally tone down that conversation, and he hasn't done enough to do that. And he's, I think, incited some of this violence. He did it on January 6th when he was leaving office, where people forget he had hundreds of people storm the Capitol and want to harm our elected officials while they were at work, and he did nothing to tone that down. And and that's why everybody was nervous about him possibly being reelected, that he was going to continue that type of conversation in this country. That if you're not with me, if you don't agree with what I say, then I could resort to taking matters into my own hands to get the results I want. And that's not the America that we want to live in.
So not wanting violence should be a bipartisan thing. If the president could do more to tone this down, why do you think he's not, Matthew?
I think that it is up to leaders in both parties and the president to take a stand here. Absolutely, President Trump should have been in Minnesota for the funeral. But to the other point about January 6th, what I saw on the ground with people who were part of those actions, where they were allowed into the Capitol by Capitol Police. Reports show the only individual who was killed on January 6th was Ashley Babbitt, an activist who arrived in the Capitol. Many other people were expressing their concern in a traditional way we do in American politics, by protesting and by rallying. There were instances of violence, there were instances of vandalism, and those can be condemned roundly. But most Americans who showed up on January 6th were very interested in expressing their viewpoint in the traditional way that we do in American
Yeah, and a lot of
politics.
those people showed up with guns and zip ties.
You know, not a lot of those people showed up with guns and zip ties. It's a common misconception that we see. Most Americans, most people who were on the grounds, on the mall, and then went into the Capitol were people who were swept up in the excitement of a rally or a protest like Occupy Wall Street in the mid-2010s, like the Tea Party in the early 2010s, exactly like those protesters.
But we do know that the records of a lot of those people who were pardoned, who were released, were violent criminal records. What message did that send in terms of calming any kind of violence when you're saying, you know, basically, job well done, now off you go?
Individuals who committed crimes in other aspects of their life, I would likely agree with Charles on criminal justice reform. As somebody who served their time in breaking the law, they should be readmitted to society and afforded their full rights. So I think connecting someone's past criminal activity with a protest or a rally is really not appropriate.
So let's talk about the internet. This plays a big role in all of this. We hear so much in the aftermath that whoever the perpetrator was radicalized online. Should lawmakers in the building a few blocks down the road from us be doing more to stop that from happening? Charles?
Yes, they should be doing more. What that something is, I'm not quite sure. You know, between any type of social media platform, whether it's X or Twitter or Instagram, you know, I do agree with my colleague that, you know, when you take a position as an elected official, you know, people think they can literally attack you, your family, and personally attack you, and that's just not right. And we need to do more, not just at the presidential level, but at the hyper local level,
Yeah.
to tone down this level of this dissent. Yeah.
Right, and where has that come from? Because, you know, this country is no stranger to violence, let's be honest about it, and political violence is part of this country's history. But this seems like a new chapter where you have these very direct threats to lawmakers. I mean, where do we go from here with that?
What is very dangerous about potentially restricting speech online is that it actually drives hateful rhetoric underground into a place where we can't see what's happening. Right now, if there are racist or sexist or misogynist tweets that are issued, we can see that out in the open and roundly condemn it. Driving that kind of rhetoric underground with a ban by the federal government is a dangerous thing for those who believe in a free and open society and those who want to expose those individuals who would foment hateful rhetoric online. I think in addition to this, we really have to look at why people get involved in politics in the first place. Over the last decade or so, government at all levels, the winners of elections have then used government to punish the people who have lost the last election. So when government in Washington or in state capitals across the country are punishing those who've lost the last election, it creates an additional layer of violence and an opportunity for violence that we haven't seen in this country. All the political violence that's existed in the United States, we have not seen the kind of violence as we're seeing over the last decade or so.
You talk about why people are getting into politics. Is there a danger if this doesn't stop that people will stop wanting to get into politics? They will literally be too scared that they will feel that immediately when they step up, there is a target on their back.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of talented people who have great ideas on how to make our country better, on how to improve the quality of life in our own neighborhoods. But those people are seeing what's happening on, you know, to elected officials in their own towns or here in DC, and they say, you know what, that's not for me. Especially if they have families. You know, when you run for office, it's not just you running for office; it's your entire family running for office and having to sacrifice that time away so you can knock on doors and kiss babies and all that good stuff. And when your family says that, says, no, Dad, I don't want you to do that. I don't want you to get hurt today. When your significant other says, you know what, I'm scared that they're going to come after me for a vote that you made. That's not the America we want to live in.
What about both of you, your personal experiences? Do you have political ambitions? Would this stop you having political ambitions, Matthew?
I couldn't agree more with Charles here in the sense that I've spoken to people in Arlington, Republicans, who would love to run for office, would love to get more involved in the civic infrastructure, but they don't want the isolation from their friends or the potential threats. Just 2 days before Election Day last year, I received a menacing, spoofed phone call from someone claiming to be federal law enforcement in an attempt to suss out what Republicans would be doing, try to identify where we were on Election Day. And this keeps good people out of politics, and even people who may have had a bankruptcy or a divorce in their history. This destroy at all cost politics even goes back into people's personal lives. It's really particularly nasty.
And just briefly from both of you, what does a meaningful response to all of this look like, Charles?
Well, again, I think it starts from the top, but not just the president, but no matter every elected official, no matter whether you're a Democrat or Republican or independent, you need to tell your constituents, like, hey, we can agree to disagree. We're not going to agree on every issue. That's fine. Let's go have a drink after the debate and move on to the next topic where we may see eye to eye on a particular issue. But we have to find a way to get past this partisan politics where, like, if you don't agree with me, then I hate you. Life is much more than that. So,
okay, Matthew, give us a solution.
I mean,
in 20 seconds.
The last 15 years, when I was chairman of the Young Republicans in Arlington, I had many Arlington Young Democrat friends, and I think we're in a different place now. It's very concerning. I'd love to be able to do that again.
Okay, Matthew, Charles, thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you.
Political violence in America isn't going away anytime soon, and we'll be following this developing story closely. That's it for this episode of Inside America. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.